welcome to this special episode of Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe, with me, Tom Sherrington, and Emma Turner. Hello, Emma.
Hello, Tom. It's double the fun tonight, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. It's been a long time planning to get you guys in the same Zoom room, but we're really thrilled to have today Isaac Moore. Welcome, Isaac.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm very glad to join you guys.
And Jade Pearce. Welcome, Jade.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so we're excited because you two have just been collaborating over the last year or so on this excellent book. So let's all wave it. Desirable Difficulties in Action. Ta-da! And obviously, as the editor of this series of books, I feel like a paternal pride, like the latest one to come through, and it's gone down really well. People are really interested in it, and although people might have heard of things like interleaving and so on, hearing it properly explained and linked to the research is not something everyone has done, and you've done an amazing job with it. So, first of all, we want to say congratulations. You've done a brilliant job.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And I came across you, through Twitter and research ed events, and you have the sort of different things that you do. I mean, Jade, you have this amazing kind of way of explaining research papers through the sort of great threads, and then and other books that you've written, so which is fantastic. So you're someone who does the reading so that other people don't have to.
Yeah, I love the reading, so I'm more than happy to do it for everybody else.
And then Isaac, the last time I bumped into you was on a corridor research ed event, and you've got an appetite for all that stuff and delivering it in practice. So let's just give you a chance to explain to people kind of what you're working at the moment, where you work, and so people know a bit of a background to you before we start talking about the book. So Isaac, do you want to kick us off?
Yes. So yes, I'm currently a deputy head teacher in a secondary school, 11 to 18, in the southeastern part of the country. I'm in charge of curriculum, so anything to do with curriculum at subject level, to do with CPD, so teacher development and all of that. Also reading. So yes, I lead on all of those things in my school. I've been a deputy head teacher now for about 2.5 years. So yes, that's me.
But I love it when someone says their job is to be in charge of curriculum and teaching and learning and CPD. You think that's like that's everything, nearly. So it's a pretty big job. Jade, what about you? Where are you working currently?
So my current role is leading professional development across a big trust of schools, a trust of 38 schools, I think it is, in the East Midlands and beyond. But actually, I start a new job on Monday. So I'm leaving my current trust and I'm going to another trust, which is more local to me and just down the road from Emma, we've just found out, which is lovely. And I'm stepping over, so still a trust-wide role, but instead of just focusing on teaching and learning and CPD, which I do in my current role, it is head of education. So looking at all aspects of our schools, really, and school improvement. So super excited to start that role on Monday.
Wow, this job's so exciting. Head of education. And how many schools are in that trust?
7. So it's 3 secondaries and 4 primaries, which is nice mix.
Oh, well, that's brilliant. So look, so it's great to have people who are working directly with teachers and schools to do this, and that's the whole spirit of the In Action series. So I don't know who wants to kick us off. So Robert and Elizabeth Bjork's Desirable Difficulties is a sort of, they've been researching this for a while. So I don't know if just the whole concept of desirable difficulties, what it is. Remember, Jade, do you want to just give an overview? What does it basically mean for there to be desirable difficulties? And then we start picking up into some of the specifics of that. But do you want to just give us a kind of overview of what do you think teachers need to know about that?
Yeah. So the simple overview is they are things that seem to make initial learning or learning more difficult. So for example, it might include retrieval practice, which feels more difficult than restudying, like rereading something. It would include space practice, which feels more difficult, and maybe lessens performance compared to maths practice, etc. So the things that we feel like the learning is more difficult, but they are desirable because actually we know that these things are more effective for long-term learning, long-term retention than maybe other strategies. That's the kind of superficial, simple explanation of what a desirable difficulty is. I think we can go further than that and look at why desirable difficulties have a benefit on long-term learning. So we can look at the difference between learning and performance, retrieval strength and storage strength. But maybe that's something to look at when you've had a look at what they look like in action, and just to really understand why they happen. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Isaac.
No, I think the way you've explained is, very, very nicely explained. They are just strategies that students find difficult. They don't like them because they make the initial learning more challenging. But they are the same strategies that support long-term retention of knowledge. So we say they are desirable because they support long-term retention of knowledge. We say they are difficult because they make the initial performance when you're learning stuff to seem difficult. So for that reason, lots of students don't like using them.
But I would say that it's really important here to address probably that it's not just anything that makes learning more difficult. Essentially, they make learning seem more difficult because the encoding, the thinking that you're doing is harder. It's harder to retrieve something from your long-term memory than it is to just reread it. But we wouldn't include, and Isaac's done a great section on this in the book, we wouldn't include anything which just makes learning more difficult but doesn't result in harder thinking, I think is the really important point. So for example, if you use discovery learning where you're asking pupils to work out for themselves how to solve a certain problem in maths, that is more difficult for them than a teacher explicitly explaining that and then going through guided practice, for example. But it doesn't actually result in better thinking, more harder, deeper processing by the students. So that wouldn't be a desirable difficulty. So I think it's really important to say this is what is included, but actually it's not just anything that makes learning more difficult for kids.
That is so well said. Emma, Emma, in your work, do you find teachers, is the concept of desirable difficulties kind of an explicitly discussed aspect of the research base that when you go into schools?
It is and it isn't. And there's a slight tension as well with talking about difficulty when you're faced with a sea of very young little faces, because it can feel counterintuitive to get very little children to want to think really, really hard, because you want them to feel like they're nice and happy and having a good time, and actually getting them to wrangle with things can feel counterintuitive. Once you understand that actually getting them to think hard is actually really helpful and can then also make them feel like they've done really well, and there's a kind of a bigger personal reward at the end of it because they feel like they've achieved something as well, it can be a bit of I don't mean a hurdle to get over, but it's a bit of a mind shift to move away from it's all comfy and lovely and we're all getting on well and we can all do this, towards actually let's ask some questions or put some tasks together that are really, really tricky and ask you to think really, really hard about this. So I do talk about desirable difficulties quite a lot, and about storage strength and retrieval strength with primary practitioners, but it hasn't been one of those things that's been touched on in massive depth in primary necessarily. And I do think part of that is because you say difficulty and you automatically, especially if you teach very, very young children, it feels counterintuitive, even though young children love challenging themselves and they love thinking hard, but it can be a difficult conversation to open up. But once it's opened up, it's great.
Yeah, I completely agree with that in terms of not just for our primary school children. It's really difficult as a teacher to get your head around the idea that what improves performance in the lesson isn't necessarily best for long-term learning. Like certainly when I started teaching, I would, mass my practice, do lots and lots of questions and repetition, because I thought, well, they're all leaving the lesson and they can all do it. They all know it. Surely that's our aim. Really difficult to get your head around the fact that actually you probably just harmed their long-term retention, whether it's, you know, younger students or older students. I also think in terms of talking about these strategies with teachers, probably the individual strategies of spacing and retrieval practice have had way more coverage, but we don't necessarily use the term desirable difficulties to explain why they are effective. We look at like retrieval practice as a strategy or spacing as a strategy without going into, and actually we need to understand the theory behind them, which I would probably advocate as much as possible, maybe.
So let's get into some of the individual things, because I think like one of the issues with it is like, it's like an umbrella term because there's a kind of common theme, but actually they're quite different. And doing them, and what the book does really well is it gives examples, which is fantastic. So let's just talk about perhaps one of the more kind of immediate ones is spacing. So why is spacing? What does it mean? I mean, I've got a sense of it, but I think it'd be interesting to hear you explain it. So Isaac, do you want to just tell us what is spacing in a nutshell?
Okay, so Jade used the term mass practice. That's when, if you have repeated episodes of learning something, mass practice is when you line them up straight after each other. So you've got 30 minutes to learn something. Say you decide you want to learn every 10 minutes, and you do all 10 minutes right after each other. So you're massing it. The idea of spacing is to leave gaps between your study sessions. So the gaps may be minutes, maybe days, maybe weeks, maybe months. It depends on what goal you have in mind, how long you want to try and remember something for. So the idea of leaving gaps between study episodes introduces forgetting. And introducing forgetting into the process, students find that difficult. So that's where the term difficulty comes from. They find that difficult. Because if I've just explained something to you, and I ask you a bunch of questions afterwards, and you get most of the answers right, it feels good, right? But if I've explained something to you and we do all of that, and I say to you, oh, I'm going to be checking. If I check straight away, of course, your success rate is going to be high. If I say to you, oh, in 3 days' time, I'm going to come back and ask you questions about those things again, I may not even tell you. 3 days' time, come and ask you a question. You're going to have to do a lot of work to try and remember most of the stuff that I explained to you 3 days before, because some forgetting would have gone into the picture. So that's the idea of spacing. It introduces a difficulty into the learning process that, although very good for retaining stuff, not very good, doesn't feel good. It doesn't seem good when you're going through it.
So I feel like this is one of those things I feel like I want your view of this, because this is my experience, like watching, say, I don't know, science lessons or something, where you've got like a quiz at the start of a lesson and the children are being quizzed and the teacher thinks I'm doing spacing because they learned this last week or last month. But what I discover happens is that the children never knew it at all.
Yeah.
But they didn't forget it, they just never knew it. So am I right in thinking that you do need to do that kind of immediate like retrieval lesson, like let me just see if you've understood it? I don't know, what are the parts of the heart, say, what are the organs, what are the different chambers in the heart? Do you know them? Yes, I know them. And then later review it with spacing. But if you just say tell the children them and then hope they'll remember them 3 weeks later, I mean, it's not gone in the first place. So that's one of the things I feel like spacing sometimes. We have to be careful with this. You have to learn it first and then space. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Jade, you're nodding your head. You want to comment at this point?
No, I'm just agreeing that there's no point doing spacing or retrieval practice because probably if we're talking about doing a quiz, it's actually spaced retrieval practice, isn't it? Not just spacing. If the initial learning wasn't good enough because you're trying to remember something that the children have never had in their long-term memory in the first place. I think what you're probably talking about, Tom, is and I'm going to refer to your own blog now, so you know it obviously because you've written a blog about it, but it's the difference between initial rehearsal to get information into the long-term memory, to encode information into the long-term memory, and then later retrieval practice to bring it back out of the long-term memory. So for example, if we were learning about, I don't know, we're in year 2 and we're learning about the parts of the plant, well, we can't just tell people the parts of the plant and then move on, because they've done no encoding, they've done no rehearsal, so they haven't actually taken that content and put it into their long-term memories. There would be no point a week later saying to our pupils, can we remember the parts of the plant, because they've never remembered that information. What we need to do is straight away do some rehearsal to encode that information into their long-term memory, which might be, I don't know, matching the part of the plant to the description of it, or labeling a diagram of a plant, for example. And then later on, now that we've put it into their long-term memories, we ask them to bring it back into their working memories through retrieval practice. So definitely no point in doing spaced or retrieval practice if you haven't done that initial encoding, would be my point there.
Can I clarify? We're all jumping in there, but I need you said something to me which I've not even thought about properly before. Okay, so the difference between spacing and spaced retrieval practice. So I think in my head, if I'm honest, I just did, just blur those together.
You think they're the same thing? Yeah.
So what would be spacing if spaced retrieval practice?
So this is just how I separate it. So I could be totally wrong. To me, retrieval practice is where you are doing something from memory. So if you're doing a do now quiz and you're asking pupils to retrieve that content from memory, that is retrieval practice. It might be spaced retrieval practice, which we now, I think, call successive relearning, is the term that's used in literature research, when you are doing retrieval practice, but it's after a delay. However, spaced practice doesn't necessarily have to be retrieval practice, and probably wasn't retrieval practice when it was first introduced. So for example, let's say if we're learning how to divide, my son's in year 2, so he's just done division, and let's say his teacher decides that they are going to spend an hour, that's an arbitrary amount, but let's just say it's an hour doing division. Her choice could be to spend an hour today doing division and to not come back to it. Or she could say, I'm going to spend half an hour today doing division. At the end of that half an hour, I'm pretty confident that all the children will be able to do division. And then next week, I'm going to do division again, not necessarily through asking pupils to do it straight away from memory. I might say, we're just going to revisit division. This is my model. Let's go through another example together. And now let's do some more practice. So it's almost like space practice is splitting the initial learning up. It's not just retrieval practice, if that makes sense.
Brilliant. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I was just thinking about one of my favourite sayings about retrieval practice and the potential nonsense of doing it when children haven't encoded it in the first place, which is you can't fish in an empty lake.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
And
that is the frustration of walking around when children are doing a do now activity and they've wasted their time writing the question because they don't know the answer, and you just think you shouldn't have bothered because it's 10 minutes where you haven't actually achieved anything. They haven't got the benefits of retrieval practice because they haven't done any retrieval. So there's a balance, isn't there, between making sure that they've encoded it in the first place, but allowing for enough forgetting, because we know that, like Isaac said, if we forget when we retrieve, we know that storage strength is then increased by a larger amount. So definitely a balance there, I guess.
Yeah, I think just to add to all of that, the importance of encoding. So, even at my school, we have this conversation about if you're asking students to retrieve and there's nothing in there for them to retrieve, it's just a total waste of time. At the point, the point where they're encountering those materials for the first time, when you're teaching them, encoding has to be done properly. Later on, maybe when we have the time to go through some of the research that we looked at, in terms of spacing, why it works and why there's a limit to it, the level of processing when children encounter knowledge, material for the first time, how well embedded that material is in their long-term memory, adding to what they already have, the integration with all the knowledge they may have in their memory, how well that happens is really, really important. Or else, yeah, just fishing in an empty lake.
Emma's like analogy knowledge or knows my mind every time. All right, there's another one. And I'm really pleased that this is included here, because I feel like in a way this is a counterpoint to that kind of thing of everything has to be standardized and routinized, you know, to the point of a kind of dullness, but ineffectiveness, because the second one is varying the conditions of practice. I think it's a great thing to have this in there, that we learn better if the way we practice information changes. So I think I asked Isaac first last time, so Jade, this is your turn. What does it mean to vary the conditions of practice in terms of being a desirable difficulty?
So Isaac knows much more about this than me, but I will start off and then he can jump in. Varying the conditions of practice essentially means that we want to change the practice that we get pupils to do, and we can do that in different ways. So what we don't want to do, for example, is always get pupils to answer the same types of questions and therefore think in exactly the same way about a topic, because that becomes really easy. But then also, I think that those neural pathways get more and more ingrained. And so your ability to think in different ways is more limited because you've always done the same thing. So my example would be if you were practicing your times tables, or even like trying to learn something off by heart when you were revising, and you always did it in the exact same order, your brain almost depends on that order in order to remember the next hint. It's got used to it being always the same. So your ability to move away from that is lessened. That's kind of my thinking about it. So essentially it's making sure that you practice in lots of different ways. Sorry, that's my dog moaning at the side of me. Making sure that you practice in lots of different ways, which makes practice more difficult, but again, makes thinking harder and so is desirable. But Isaac, I'm going to let you jump in because you're the expert on this one.
Okay, so the goal of learning is for students to acquire knowledge and to be able to use that knowledge flexibly. If the condition under which students are acquiring the knowledge stays the same, then, you know, it becomes really difficult for them to be able to use knowledge flexibly. So varying condition of practice means making the condition under which practice is done a little bit unpredictable, because you want students to be able to gain that flexibility. So the examples that you put in front of students has to introduce some kind of difficulty in terms of the unpredictability. The condition under which they're doing the work, the questions that you put in front of them. The very good example I use, I know I'm not as good as Emma when it comes to coming up with analogies and stuff, but it's with driving. When I'm learning to drive, if someone is learning to drive and they do all their driving on a straight road, there are no bends, no curves, no hills, and all of that. If that's all you're learning, when it comes to the day of your test, if they put you on a road that is very different from that, you may struggle. Same way, if all your driving practice is done when it's dry, when it suddenly rains, again, you may really struggle. So we vary the condition of practice because we want our students to acquire knowledge under a lot of different conditions, because we never know what is going to be put in front of them. We want their knowledge to be flexible enough for them to be able to use that knowledge, whatever the condition you put in front of them.
If that got a link, Isaac, and I might have got this wrong, to the kind of the novice expert continuum, as in the more different ways they see that knowledge presented or that problem presented, that changes the number of kind of structures of it, so that they become more au fait with that as they move along the novice to expert continuum. They understand the structure of the learning and therefore have multiple strategies to solve it, rather than actually just having that one single route. Like, this is the only way I know to get from my house to the post office. That's the route I'm going to take. If that road's shut, I've got nowhere to go. I haven't got an alternative route. So it's kind of nudging them along that continuum by doing that variation. Is there a link there, or have I got that wrong?
I think there's a link. Obviously, in our book, we haven't covered that link, but you're absolutely right, because an expert is someone that becomes someone that is flexible with what they have, someone that can use what they have in lots of different ways. They can think about stuff. Obviously, because of that expertise they have, even when they come across situations that they maybe haven't experienced before, they have enough about them to be able to think about stuff and figure stuff out. So I think there's a link. It's just we haven't covered that in the book.
It covers things like, you know, examples and non-examples. I mean, there's a great, one of the features of the book, which I love, is the case studies. And there's a lovely case study by Jenny Webb, who we've also spoken to on Mind the Gap, where she talks about an example she gives in English is about the active or passive voice. And then there's a lovely list of, you know, tell us whether the text is written in active or passive voice, or tell us the difference between the active and passive voice, or tell us why someone might use the active voice. Tell us the possible effect of using this, and independently notice it and then start using it in your own writing. And it's all like layers on layers of exploring active and passive voice. You can see that over a curriculum sequence where that same thing has been practiced in different ways, the learning is going to be rich and strong. So that's the kind of thing, isn't it? And even the simple thing like the way you ask, I mean, you have a lovely list of there, the way you ask questions, and so on. So that one makes sense. But it's interesting sometimes, like if you've got a bank of questions that are always the same type, you've got to remember to mix them up then, haven't you? As a teacher, if you're planning, you've got to be conscious of that. Don't just make them always familiar.
Yeah, when I talk about varying the condition of practice, I always give the example of students going into a test or an exam, then coming back to tell you, sir, we didn't learn that. Because the particular question that they've seen in the exam, or the context around the question they've seen in the exam, is totally different from whatever they were exposed to in your classroom. So varying the condition of practice, you know, is exposing students to all kinds of changing the context of the questions that you put in front of them. Varying the condition of practice can also be physical, as in, I do some in school, I do some at home, I do some work in my bedroom, I go to the dining area to do some work. By changing the physical environment in which stuff is done, like some of the research that we've referenced in the book, where you ask students, to learn stuff in one room and then go and take the test in another room, versus you ask them to learn stuff in one room to notice the layout of the room, because you want them to link the knowledge that they've learned in that room to the physical layout of the room or specific things in the room, and then putting them in a different room to do the test. All of that affects how well students can recall stuff that they've learned in the previous room. So the physical environment also counts as part of that. And in my school, it's one of the things that we've built into the way we learn when we set homework. Do some in school, give them more to go and do at home, bring them back the next day, that kind of stuff. There are little ways that teachers can go about it just to vary the physical environment in which their students are learning.
Wow, so interesting. I think it's go on, Emma.
No, I was just dying. I'm dying to say this because this is something that we used to do inadvertently, not knowing about this variation of practice. Because one of the things we used to do as a staff was to say, right, here's a problem, like a maths problem or a science problem. Can everybody give a question? How would you ask the children a question about this? And then building up a bank of questions that other people and using other people's way of asking the questions in your classroom, so that you've got that kind of different voice. Because the way you ask questions as a teacher is often you kind of fall into a groove of doing it. But actually calling on your colleagues to say, how would you ask this question? What would you ask of the children? And it was just such a quick win in terms of coming at that from a different angle, rather than have to wrangle with it yourself and think, well, what are 10 different ways I could phrase this?
Obviously, doing that reduces workload for everybody, but that's not what this is about. different teachers contributing questions that may be slightly different about the same thing is a good way to put questions in front of students that allow them to gain what I call flexible knowledge.
Yeah, that's flexibility is. I mean, I love that. One of the examples I've come across recently was in the science world was there's a classic thing you learn in science, which is about potatoes. You know, it's a very cheap experiment to do where you put potatoes into different water, you know, still distilled water, salty water, and it goes either turgid or flaccid, and everyone laughs about those words. But then the exam question had carrot, like, oh no, we didn't do carrot, we did potato. Thinking, no, it's the same.
Yeah, I think that's the whole point here then, or one of the main points is the near transfer of learning. And if you only ever look at knowledge in one way, you're not going to achieve even near transfer of learning. Pupils aren't going to be able to take their knowledge that they did from the potato experiment and apply it to a carrot experiment because it's fixed on the potato experiment. If you look at it in different ways, that ability to apply their learning to different scenarios, different questions, different applications is improved.
Wow, that's great. And so initially, yeah, so this is so good, so interesting. All right, now we've got to tackle the hard one now. I think it's one of the least well understood ideas, given its power. Interleaving, it gets all sort of corrupted, and so I don't know which one. Who wants to volunteer to introduce the world to interleaving from your eyes?
I think Jade should do it. She's the expert.
I'm not the expert, but I will do it. I love interleaving. So
tell us about
I think the issue with interleaving is that what we have previously seen as being interleaving actually isn't interleaving. So even if you read research-informed blogs, etc., from 5 years ago, and they're talking about interleaving, it's now not what we know interleaving to be. So interleaving is the mixing up of similar but slightly different concepts, topics, questions. So for example, in maths, interleaving would be mixing up multiplying fractions, dividing fractions, subtracting fractions, and adding fractions. They are slightly different. Pupils get confused about what to do with each one. And so if we mix them up and ask one question on multiplying, then one question on dividing, one question on adding, one question on subtracting, etc., that's interleaving. What is not interleaving is revising science, then revising history, then revising English, or teaching science, history, English, or in English, teaching Romeo and Juliet, and then poetry, and then spelling, punctuation, and grammar, for example. So I think the issue with interleaving is that we used to think that we could, as long as we mix things up, whether it be subject, topics, etc., that was fine. Actually, what we now know is that interleaving is only effective because of something called the discriminative contrast hypothesis, which basically says it's effective because when you place similar things next to each other, dividing and adding fractions, for example, it helps pupils to see the differences between them. And so therefore they become more clear in your mind. You stop getting them confused. So for example, I'm an economics teacher. So I used to teach exchange rates and teach interest rates separately, but then I would interleave them. What's an interest rate? What's an exchange rate? What impact does an increase in interest rate have? What impact does an increase in exchange rates have? Because doing them next to each other help pupils to realise the differences between them. So that's what it is, basically.
So you'll have to run that one by me again. The hypothesis. What was it?
Yeah, the discriminative contrast hypothesis, as in we can contrast them, and so we are more able to discriminate between them. This is how I add fractions. This is how I divide fractions. This is an interest rate. This is an exchange rate, and I've been made to realise and think about the differences.
Wow, and it's the kind of about the. So within maths, then let's be really nerdy about this. So I get that, so, but say doing kind of like algebra, then coordinates, and then
So this is where maths gets super interesting,
apart, isn't it?
Yeah. So actually, maths not as much. So in a normal subject, research has shown that the two topics have to be similar for it to be of any benefit. If you're doing like a 10-question quiz and it's on 10 random topics, but students don't confuse any of them, that's fine, but you're not going to get any more benefits than if you just did 10 questions on one topic, 10 questions on another topic. It only works if you're interleaving those things that people get confused about. In maths, you can interleave within topics. So for example, within algebra, you could do a question that asks you to factorize, then a question which asks you to expand, or whatever people get confused about. But maths is actually the one subject now where we know from research that just interleaving wider topics is also beneficial. I don't know if that's because all of maths is confused by pupils, like they just get everything confused, coordinates and something else and something else.
It's all connected, isn't it? So the underlying reasoning is connected, so
and more similar maybe than in other subject areas. So maths is the one subject where actually you do definitely still get benefits by interleaving different questions on coordinates, or let's interleave perimeters and circumference and something else. But actually within maths, you can also interleave distinct topics, and that will still be more beneficial, I think. I'm not a maths teacher, it's just what I've read.
So Isaac, what's the inaction element of that then? How do we use that?
I think one of the other things that Jade talked about is placing those two things that you're interleaving side by side. So am I right in saying there's no delay, there's no space in between them?
Yeah,
so
because as soon as you put a delay in, you've made it harder for people to do that discrimination. Yes. So you want to do them concurrently at the same time.
Yeah. So it's the benefit, you get more benefit from it when you put them side by side and you compare them and you notice how they are different.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think it's also really important to note that it's not just practice, as in we're going to teach them separately and then you're going to have a go with interleave practice, which is super important. But you can also use it when you are introducing new content which is similar. So I think I've used the example in the book of if you were looking at types of rock in science, for example, or categorizing animals into different types of animals. You can also do it when you initially present the information. It doesn't have to just be as like a encoding rehearsal task. So 2 ways that we can use it.
Well, that's fantastic. So those sort of mixed up topic timeline things, which were color coded and stuff, I was seeing if you were a bit like, that's not it.
I've been wrangling the whole time you've been talking about what might be the most stupid analogy I've ever come up with.
Let's hear it. I'm excited.
Is interleaving a cheese board, not a buffet?
Yes.
So you put the same, they're all cheese.
Oh my God.
But they're not a buffet. It's not like sausage roll, pizza slice, fruit kebab. It's not that. It is how is the brie different from the camembert, similar to the Stilton, different from the. I gotcha. I'm with you. I'm with the cheese board now, Jade.
And it's also not putting different types of cheeses on the board and eating them at different times. No, at the same time, you place them next to each other.
I'm glad I've lowered the intellectual tone.
So in a way, it's closer to the sort of varying the conditions of practice in a way. It's sort of it's connected, isn't it? Because you've got this idea of varying. Because Jade, that was interesting to me that you were saying you might even interleave at the point of instruction rather than in the practice, and that to me is like that's quite interesting to me. So, because as a teacher, I would be more worried about sort of
confusion. So I wouldn't do it with anything. I think interleaving at the point of instruction is if you are trying to get pupils to categorize. So the famous experiment is we've got to learn to identify an artist by the painting. So we need to look at, instead of saying, these are all this artist's paintings, let's have a look at them. Then let's have a look at this artist's paintings. Then let's have a look at another one. You say, this is artist A, this is artist B, this is artist C, A, B, C at the point of instruction. But that is a more simple task, I suppose, in terms of you're only saying it's this artist, it's this artist. What I wouldn't do, and actually we do address it in the book, is that for anything complex, how to divide fractions, how to multiply fractions, you should probably do blocked practice first of all, mass practice first of all, where you're doing all of the work on how to do dividing, then how to do multiplication, and only when it's secure interleave them together.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The more complex what you're trying to teach students is, the more you should make sure students understand each stuff first. After they fully understood each stuff, then you can put them next to each other. So that wouldn't, putting stuff straight next to each other at the point of instruction wouldn't work for a lot of the stuff that we teach, for example, in science.
Yeah, it's also because the concepts are too big. So you wouldn't be able to, you can't interleave things that are huge, because it's not really interleaving. If you need to know lots about them, then you're not actually putting them next to each other in a time span, I suppose.
Well, so I love all this stuff because it makes you think hard, doesn't it? And it's sort of, you got to sort of get some fluency up. So repetition is helpful to keep saying it. But then, like today, I had this. One of the things I'm trying to do in my life is learn to speak French, and you know, I'm 58, and I tell you what, it ain't easy remembering stuff from one lesson to the next. And today we did dictation, and I've never done it before. So just my tutor who's online, she just says, okay, let's try this. And so she said a few things in French, and I had to type them in French as she was doing it. And this was amazing because it's linking in, like that's an adjectival agreement, that's the past tense. And she did this sort of saying, where like there's what do you call them, homophones, so that sounds the same as that, but you have to think which one is it. And this was interleaving to the max. It's like I'm having to practice lots of different elements of language here in the same flow, and it was definitely difficult, but I'm hoping now that it will be, the whole point is it's beneficial. But it's that mixing up is where you feel like the fluency is coming, because you have to go, oh, it's in this situation. But that was what's interesting there is that she's just one-to-one and telling me where I went wrong. Whereas in a class, you've got like to do that with everyone at the same time. It's not easy, is it? To check in on the success rate of students en masse in that way. So you have to design tasks quite well, I would have thought, for the interleaving effect to be even sort of useful, manageable for the teacher to cope with that. But so
yeah, I think just like I'm sorry, I was just going to say, just like we discussed with the spacing as well, there's no point interleaving the material if the initial learning wasn't good enough, because they don't know it enough to interleave it, and you'll probably just confuse them. So I think it's a similar kind of thing. If it's complex material, make sure they've learned it and understood it and encoded it properly first, and then interleave it to add a level of difficulty, rather than doing it to start off with, I think, properly.
That might be my problem, not learning it very well. Well, look, we got to. I mean, we don't want to. You can't do justice to this whole thing in one episode. But we just got. So for me, those are sort of space practice, and retrieval practice. We could talk about more, but there are some other things towards the back of your book which start talking about independent study and that. So I was interested in that, like. Why? Because it's not one of the sort of headline items that people think, oh, we've got space retrieval and interleaving and varying practice. But what was the source of that? Do the Bjorks talk about that specifically, or was that your idea to have a section on that?
I think it was because we know that the desirable difficulties as strategies should obviously be used by teachers, and more in schools, they obviously are being used by teachers. So we are using retrieval practice, and we're using space practice, and we are using interleaving. And then when our students prepare for tests, for example, or do self-study, they go back to all the things that we know they shouldn't be doing. So they reread, they highlight, they math, they block their practice, etc. So I think the point here was that actually, if we can use them in our classroom, that's amazing. But if our students aren't using that themselves, we're diluting the impact that these strategies could have. So one of the main things that we need to do in education is educate our pupils and make sure that when they are doing their independent study, sorry, it's my dog again, we are getting them to use the strategies as well. So actually we're teaching most effectively and they're studying most effectively, I think was the point there.
Yeah, I think the point Jade's just made is the same point the Bjorks have made, in that a lot of teachers, we now know about these things, but we still have a lot of students that don't use these strategies. So I talk a lot in my school. I do assemblies with students where I talk about how learning happens and the things that we need to do to make sure we retain knowledge long term. And I also talk to our teachers about how these strategies are essential to students feeling successful and being able to be more successful in the future. So talking about the independent practice side of it is taking everything we've talked about in the book and using those things to try and help students. For example, I have my 12-year-old, the last 2 weeks he's been preparing for tests. He wanted to restudy, get his books. I'm like, no. Have you not read my book? So we have a joke about it. Now he has a plan where he spaced things out. So instead of getting his highlighting is not a problem, but it shouldn't be the end of the journey. So instead of doing all of those things, he's now like, I'm going to get my flashcards. I'm going to ask myself questions. I'm going to self-quiz. I'm going to do this. And then he tells me, but I don't feel like I'm learning. And I say, but you are learning. It just doesn't feel like that right now because there's no way you can assure yourself that, all of these things are working. B, that assurance you're looking for is not right there right now. But I know you're learning. And, when you've done your test, let's have this conversation again. So it's that kind of stuff, taking it out to students, teaching them how to do this thing so that they can be more successful, so that they can do it even more.
Yeah. I love that. What a great study strategy for a 12-year-old. That's amazing. I also think, to answer the second part of your question, Tom, it is something that the Bjorks have researched and have written about. They have done lots of research, so have lots of other people, on the study strategies that are used by pupils when they do independent study, why they choose certain techniques over the techniques that we need to be we know that they should be using. And they've also done lots of research on how we can actually get pupils to use the techniques that we know are more effective. So things like Isaac said, like actually educating pupils about how we learn and why strategies are effective, and making them use strategies in their homework, setting homework of design some flashcards, use them, you've got a test coming up, is some of the things that they would have suggested.
Well, that's fantastic. So that last section is kind of aimed at them.
Yes, it is, but it's also at teachers, explain to teachers how they can get pupils to use the strategies as well. I'm frozen.
Yeah. We'll just give him a second. He might be able to join us again. Mine was doing it earlier. We've not had the best luck.
Regime.
Welcome back, Tom.
You're back.
I'm back in the room. So I was saying, so is this how you're going to be changing your home study centre, Emma?
Oh, me? Oh, the home study centre at the moment is being supported by anything I can find. So learning walkthroughs. This is my first foray into having a child of secondary school age. To say I'm out of my comfort zone is an understatement. So anything like this that is super helpful. So yeah, I've definitely spoken to my eldest about spaced practice and interleaving and not blocking and not massing, whether it's going in, because I'm not actually a real teacher, I'm just mum.
Oh.
Yeah, it's never accepted as much, is it, when it's mum? Never accepted as much.
I'm going to clip up that bit that Isaac's just said and make you listen to it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think this is fantastic in a way, because I like the way that comes to that conclusion, and it's just, the most recent thing I've tried to work on is the learning walkthroughs, so trying to address these ideas to children and put them in their language. And I have no idea how well it will go down, but you sort of feel like at least trying to educate students about it, so that they don't just sort of that ridiculous thing of just grazing over your notes and just hoping it will sink in somehow, and that the self-testing and knowing that that's a better process, all of that. But look, honestly, we have to stop there, but it's so amazing. I want to just congratulate you both, because I know that, I mean, sometimes I follow what you're doing on Twitter, and I see your job titles and stuff. I think you just like got two absolutely immense jobs doing the real work, and I mean, I just sort of swan around doing stuff, and in the space of all of that, you've managed to pull this book together, and I think it's fantastic. I have to say, you know, it's a complex area. You've made it very practical, very accessible, and it has the seal of approval from the Bjorks themselves, who wrote a lovely foreword for it. So look, huge congratulations, and I hope that lots of people, you know, check it out and read it and use it. So, but well done to both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for all the support, the encouragement. Yeah, that really helped.
That's what I love about being the editor of the series. I do almost nothing, and then the books come out, and it's good. So look, everyone go and read this. But let's just say again, thank you so much to everyone listening to Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe. This has been a brilliant episode, talking to two brilliant people, and I hope you've really enjoyed it. And we've got some amazing guests coming up. I think next up in our recording list is David Didow, and soon after that we'll be talking to Christine Council, and you know, it's great. So lots of exciting guests coming up. Thank you for listening. We're thrilled with the audience that we get for each episode, and join us again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Mind the Gap. I'm Emma Turner, and I've been presenting with my co-host Tom Sherrington. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, share on social media, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on our YouTube channel, search for Mind the Gap with Tom and Emma, or head over to Spotify for an audio version. This podcast was produced in association with Haringey Education Partnership, and our producer for today's episode was Luke Kemper.